Cool. Right. Oh yeah, made it literally All right, let's go ahead and get started. What'd you guys think of that introduction? A few words we haven't talked about yet. Yeah? Yeah? Okay. So there are two things we're going to do today. One, I'm going to give kind of a brief overview of the mechanisms of natural selection, and how does natural selection work. And then we're going to have time to discuss your introduction. Figure out which things you feel comfortable with, which things that you still don't know, which things that you can figure out after the brief discussion of natural selection. Does that sound like a good plan? Good, because that's the plan I have. All right. I wanted to show you this picture briefly just because it's fun. This is Joe Gunn. He graduated from Jewel in 2015, and he decided to use his Journey grant to go do research in the Galapagos. And so this is him with one of these saddle-shaped shell Galapagos tortoises. His research there was actually in tracking penguins, and he said they were kind of hard to find. This is my favorite of his pictures, because he just looks like, I'm the handsomest lizard on the whole planet. He looks very pleased with himself. Although I think perhaps that look on his face just means the sun feels really great right now. I get that look on my face when I go in the sun. My kids call me a lizard. Of course, while he was there, he had to take pictures of the finches. He couldn't get super close to them. Based on these pictures, what time of year do you think that Joe went to the Galapagos? Pardon? Right before summer. Whose summer? What? Give me months.
Like December, January.
Exactly. So when he went and spent his Journey grant money, he went to the Galapagos over Christmas break.
Something I don't quite understand is if the Galapagos are right on the equator, why do they operate on the southern hemisphere's seasonal cycle?
Because then, well, you guys actually might know this, right? Okay, so that's an excellent question. I think it relates pretty directly to some of the stuff that we talked about last time and time before, right? So what happens over the year, over the months, with temperature fluctuation in the northern hemisphere? As far as range of temperatures.
Temperature goes up around July, August. August and then goes down around January and December.
Okay, we have a relatively dramatic change in average temperature across those months, right? Do we have as dramatic a change of temperature in the Galapagos? No, not really. We've got some change in temperature over the year, but it's pretty mild. Would you say that's pretty typical for places right around the equator? Yeah, absolutely. So why are the Galapagos so seasonal? Most places right along the equator are big rainforests, right? Or in the middle of South America. What do those countries look like? Are they super seasonal?
Depends on where you are.
Depends on where you are. Okay. What are the things that make it depend in the Galapagos?
Ocean currents.
The ocean currents. Those are the major drivers of the seasonality, right? We talked about how you've got cold ocean currents versus warm ocean currents, the occurrence of El Nino. So really, that's a lot of what's driving the seasonality.
Well, I got the El Nino, but that's once every decade or so.
That's true, and so that's an extreme seasonality. So the seasonality becomes very extreme when there's an El Nino year because there's a lot more rain. But you do have seasonality based on the shifting of those currents every single year.
Yeah, one thing we didn't go through when we were talking about seasonality is we didn't talk about the fact that the Earth is tilted about a 23.5-degree angle relative to its path around the sun. That's what leads to seasonality in the northern hemisphere, but it also leads to a shifting. I mentioned this in passing. I didn't make a big deal out of it, but it also leads to a shifting north and south throughout the year of where the most intense energy from the sun is coming. And so that also takes all of the air currents and ocean currents and shifts them up and down throughout the year, up in latitude and down in latitude. Because at the equinox, so when the equinox is coming up here later on in September 22nd, we'll be at a position where it's 12 hours of light, 12 hours of night, all throughout the world. And that means that the Earth is centered the sun is centered exactly over the equator, which is why everybody gets the same amount of light. As we go into winter, the sun shifts because of the angle of the Earth's rotation around its axis relative to its path around the sun. The Earth shifts in such a way that the southern hemisphere is getting more sunlight at the vernal, what we call at the winter solstice for us, which is the shortest day of the year. It's the southern hemisphere's longest day of the year. And at that point, the sun is directly over the Tropic of Capricorn, the southern tropical latitude, which means that the equator is actually getting a little less sunlight. Well, as the sunlight shifts, as the solar inputs shift downward, that also shifts where the bands of air circulation are found and also where the bands of oceanic circulation are around. So you get this slight shift up and down of the Panama current and the Humboldt current. They also move up and down slightly. And it just happens to be during our winter when the Panama current tends to dominate more than the Humboldt current coming up from Antarctica. So you now have warmer waters around. There's a section in your book that talks about seasonality and how the tilt of the Earth and all that works. There are also tons of really good animations. And last Friday, I also posted an interesting thing on the IGN2 site where you can go and you can see all of the air currents in the world in real time. But the other thing that you can do is you can click back on that to past time periods so you can see what air currents were like in December of last year. It takes a little while to click back that far, but if you do it far enough back, you can actually see these air currents move back and forth. And they also show ocean currents there as well. It's a pretty cool little data tool. If you didn't log on and take a look at it, it's kind of.
That answer your question?
So if I understand that correctly, the reason why the equatorial Galapagos do not have 2 summers, one at each equinox, is because the currents sort of counteract that and make it even more seasonal because of the natural shift of the southern and northern hemispheres.
Well, I mean, we have 2 equinoxes, right? I mean, there's,
But for us, the equinoxes are fall and spring, but in the equator, because the sun is overhead, wouldn't it be hotter then?
think of how to answer your question. Remember we talked about how there's very little variation in actual temperature because there's actually very little difference in angle of sun there. Yeah, only a few degrees. So really what's driving these changes in weather is the ability of where the direct rays of the sun are hitting on those ocean currents and air. What'll happen then is that those will move, right? And they move in a particular direction. So it doesn't matter if the sun is directly on this spot that's far away from Galapagos or close to Galapagos. What matters is what direction that air and water is moving after it gets really heated, right? So we have part of the year where it's the warmer current, Panama, is going toward the Galapagos, and that makes it rainier there.
Yeah, go back to in the introduction slides, there's a slide that shows the Panama and the Peruvian current. And you'll see that those are both kind of converging at the Galapagos. So it doesn't take much of a north or south shift to have the Galapagos being dominated by the Panama current versus being dominated by the cold water Peruvian current.
It really is kind of a special effect of it being right in the middle of those 2 currents coming together. Because if they shift just a little bit upward or downward, then suddenly all the water around the Galapagos is cold, or suddenly all of the water around the Galapagos is warm. All right, I want to remind you of the learning goals from September 1st, which was like last 2 Fridays ago, but basically it was prerequisites for natural selection to occur. You guys are probably getting really used to this now. So what are some of those things that we have to have for natural selection to occur?
Variability in fitness.
Okay. Variability in fitness. Okay, what else?
Some part of the variation in humidity.
Okay. Okay, what else? They have to be able to reproduce. Now they're able to, at least some of them are able to because of this one, right? We have variability in fitness, and fitness is a combination of survival and reproduction. And so really this one is just, okay, there's varying abilities to reproduce. This one is going to say that they actually go ahead and do. And this one is often assumed. What else? So you have variation in fitness. Okay. There's a genetic basis for it. What do you suppose? Oh, go ahead.
I think that I've written down variation exists, so in general, and then individual variation is terrible. Inter-individual variation results in inter-individual variation, which is violent and reproduction. That's part of
We don't have to
it exists.
Well, and so we've got variation in fitness here. We don't actually have the trait that we're interested in, right? Okay, so fitness in itself can be considered a trait. Usually we're thinking about a particular trait like the coloration in the true offspring, or the beak size and shape of the finches in the Henry article.
Well, what matters is that the trait that we're looking at affects fitness and is heritable.
Right. Okay. So we need variation in the trait. That variation has to be genetic, which makes it heritable. And we'll talk about what we need to define heritability. And that this heritable variation then causes variation in fitness among individuals. Okay, so we're going to assume that organisms will produce. We need variation in the trait that we're interested in. That variation has to be genetic, at least partially, so that it's heritable. And that heritable variation in the trait has to then impact fitness. Awesome, guys. Okay, I just rewrote those. I have number 4, that individuals must reproduce, kind of in gray, because we can sort of assume that. Okay. So you've got among individual variation in the trait is heritable, and it affects fitness. All right, so today we're going to talk about, okay, well, what makes a trait heritable, right? We're going to talk about how a gene can affect a trait. How do genetically determined traits affect fitness? And then we're going to talk about genetic variation as a population level metric. So we're not talking about genetic variation within us, an individual. Yes, my genome is quite variable from end to end, but really what we're talking about is variation among individuals within a population, right? Right, so the first thing that we're going to talk about is heritability. So one of our prerequisites is, okay, we probably have variation in our trait in the first place. That's probably what made us get interested in it, right? We need that variation to be heritable. Well, what does that mean? Okay. What is or is not a heritable trait? All right, to define that, we got to figure out what is a trait. What would you guys say a trait is?
Probably like some type of distinguishable characteristic of
Sure.
whether physically
I'm going to say it's any sort of observable characteristic of an organism.
I assume that you don't mean with our eyes, because there's like a trait for some people being able to produce lactase and others can't.
That's correct. Anything observable doesn't necessarily have to be with your eyes. It could be with a chemical analysis. It could be with sequencing the genome. Anything that you can observe about a character or about an organism. It could be a behavior. It could be blood type. All right, so anything observable. Now we have to figure out what a heritable trait is. Now you guys know a little bit about, we've talked a little bit about this. What makes it heritable? Okay. Has to be able to be passed from one generation to the next. Let's put a little bit more specificity in there. My granny gave me a Bible that has like family names written in the back. She passed that one from one generation to the next, but that's not heritable. It is my inheritance, I suppose.
It has to be a characteristic to pass down from one generation to the next, eye color.
Okay. And put the word characteristic right there. Okay, it's a characteristic that's passed down from one generation to the next. Okay?
The first one genes.
Pardon?
Genes.
Through genes.
Through genes. Excellent. Okay. We're going to add a little bit of a layer that is sometimes confusing. Here's a picture of, you know, a typical family from 2011. You've got two parents, you've got two children. Is the presence of a head in the children a heritable trait?
Yes.
Okay, I have yes. Anybody say no?
Yes, maximum visible.
Yes, we've got two yeses.
Maximum visible.
Unless someone were to be beheaded, that's
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, so just without the possibility of beheading, you would think that the presence of a head is a heritable trait. I will tell you that it is not. Under the definition that we use in evolutionary genetics, for something to be heritable, it must have the possibility of being variable. For it to be heritable, there must be genetic variation for the trait in the population. And we'll get more into why that is the case. On one level, it's simply a mathematical reason. But on another level, when you think about looking at families that are biologically related, and think, oh, that baby has dad's eyes. So cute, right? Or that is unfortunate that that baby has mom's nose, right? What we're interested in when we're thinking about natural selection and change over time, change over generations, is traits that have variation in them, right? You can't have variation in whether you or not you have a head because you don't survive. You're not born alive. Okay. What we're interested in is the heritability of traits, meaning not everybody has that. If everybody has it, we're not really very interested in it, right? It's not interesting from an evolutionary perspective. If there's variation in it, then it becomes fodder for natural selection. You can have natural selection or artificial selection acting upon that because there's variation in the trait. If there's no variation, then either the environment kills everybody or it makes everybody live, but there's no variation in fitness in response to variation in the trait because there's no variation in the trait. Okay, so for something to be heritable, the way that geneticists and evolutionary biologists define it, for something to be heritable, it has to not only be passed down from generation to generation, which the presence of a head, yes, is passed down from generation to generation, but it also has to have some variability in the population. Questions? Okay.
So, can there be natural selection between species?
Right, so I'm gonna rephrase your question and tell me if I've got it right. You're saying, can there be natural selection
in population.
within a population? Yeah. So we're gonna talk a little bit more about this later, but the unit of natural selection, okay, natural selection acts upon individuals, but really then what changes is populations within the larger species, and maybe over time the whole species, right? Okay, so we're talking about genetic variation, we're talking about within a population, right, at a particular time, right? And then, so natural selection is acting always on the individual, but the result of natural selection is a change in the population distribution of traits. Does that answer your question? All right, so it has to have a genetic basis, passed from generation to generation, and it has to have some variation in the trait. Okay. So we're going to think a little bit about what genetic variation is for a moment. Variation in the gene. Okay, well, what's a gene? Oh, I gave you all the answers. That's not what I intended to do. Yeah. Okay. What's a gene? What?
Just like a piece of DNA that's gonna code for the trait.
Okay, piece of DNA is going to code for a trait. Absolutely. Okay, and let's see, what is the relationship of chromosomes to genes?
Genes are very much specific.
Right, so you have a big chromosome, it's going to have thousands of genes on it, right? And each gene is located in a specific spot on that chromosome. Okay, awesome. So if we look at the hierarchy here, we've got, here I have a little picture of a karyotype. A karyotype is just when you kind of smoosh a cell, and when it's dividing, the chromosomes are all bunched up, all compacted, stain them. You can kind of see stripes there. A chromosome is one double-stranded molecule of DNA. It is just one molecule. In humans, it's 6 feet long, but it's one molecule. One really, really immensely long molecule. We have 46 in each of our cells, well, in most of our cells. Red blood cells don't have DNA in them. They don't have nucleus at all. Then we're going to think about genes, right? And now I put a little box around one of these bands. In reality, there's probably hundreds of genes inside that little band. I just couldn't make the box small enough. But a gene is one little short segment of the chromosome, and like you guys said, it codes for a product, okay? A lot of the times it codes for protein, sometimes it just codes for RNA, and the RNA will go and do a job in the cell. Questions about that? We'll talk about this last one here in just a minute. All right, and then DNA is a chain of nucleotides. A nucleotide is one of the small molecule, the 4 small molecules that are common inside the cell. You've got nucleotides, fatty acids, carbs, basically, sugars, right? And amino acids, and those are the 4 building blocks of all life. Nucleotides are one of the 4 building blocks, right? So these nucleotides, they form a chain, and they non-covalently bind with another chain to make double-stranded DNA. And the order of those nucleotides from one end of that chain to the other determines what protein is made, or if protein is made at all. So I have here just a little double helix. These sides are sugars and phosphate groups. It's actually goes like that, like a spiral staircase. The steps of the spiral staircase are non-covalently bound nitrogenous bases. And when you hear people talk about DNA, you hear them talk about letters, right? What letters do you usually hear about? A, C, G, and T. Those are just shorthand names for the different types of nitrogenous bases that are in the middle. Except for those nitrogenous bases, every other part of the DNA is the same from nucleotide to nucleotide. And this is just an inset picture of those nitrogenous bases. You've got a sugar phosphate backbone here, 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 and you've got these nitrogenous bases in the middle that are hydrogen bound here and here. A, T, C, and a G. I will not expect you to be able to recognize A's, T's, C's, and G's and tell them apart. On an exam, though, I would love for you to be able to tell me this hierarchy, right? That nucleotides are the building blocks. The DNA is a chain of nucleotides, two chains of nucleotides. With one double-stranded molecule of DNA, the chromosome. And that there are many genes per chromosome. All right, so we've got a heritable trait has a genetic basis. There's genetic variation that causes variation in the trait. One word that you will have to be familiar with is phenotype. Okay. The phenotype as opposed to the genotype. Okay, so the genotype is what form of the gene you have chemically. Okay, what is that order of nucleotides on that piece of DNA? Then the phenotype is the version of that trait that you have. Okay, so I want us to think about these little pocket mice. I want us to think about fur color. So in your groups, decide what phenotypes these mice have. for fur color.
Did you do that?
All right, what phenotypes do we have with these mice as far as fur color goes?
Light and dark.
Light and dark. Okay, so we've got some light and dark. And, you know, maybe even some in between. This guy is lighter than that guy, but maybe he's a little darker than that guy. Okay, so we have light and dark, not pink, right? But like maybe brown. Okay, all right. So if I were going to graph this phenotype here, so the trait is fur color, and the phenotypes are those colors included in the population. So let's say we have very dark on one end, and we have very light on the other end, and so we have this gradient of increasing melanism going from one end of the extreme to the other. Okay. These are a pretty famous case study on natural selection in these mice. What do you think about their backgrounds that they're on there?
Well, the top two are just not all that they survive if they blend in more with like their surroundings, where the bottom two kind of stick out.
The color goes along with the design what the color is similar to that.
The last thing you said, what was it? Their color?
Yeah, I think that color is much it's kind of like camouflage.
Okay, so you would expect that these guys would be more camouflage, really, from predators. Okay, so these mice, these guys, live on a beach with white sand. These guys live very close to that beach, but going into the forest in these sort of black rocks and dark soil. They are close enough to each other that they can interbreed. Let's think about fitness for a second. If you were to look at this area, okay, that includes the beach and the forest with the dark rocks, who would have the highest fitness? You think the one in the rocks? Okay, tell me more about that.
Well, I guess you get light, they do hide and nesting under rocks or caves in the ground.
So you're thinking maybe there's a little bit more place to hide there, so maybe little caves or something like that. Okay, all right.
Maybe more food for
Possibly, yeah. So if you think about the gradient of colors of pocket mice in that forest where the rocks are, which are going to be the ones that have the highest fitness within that population? The ones that probably mostly match the rocks, right? So let's say that is the color of the rocks. So within this population, those mice that most closely match the color of the rocks are probably going to have the highest fitness in the forest, right? Okay, and so you can probably graph their fitness like that. As they get darker than the rocks, they start to stand out to those predators. As they get lighter than the rocks, they start to stand out from those predators. Can you say the same thing for the beach mice?
Yes.
Yes, so tell me more about that.
The lighter fur is going to stick out more. The lightest fur is going to stick out more in the sand, but as you get closer to the sand color, fur is going to get a little bit darker.
Okay, yeah, absolutely. And so if the sand color is here, then we can graph fitness for the beach population like that. Now, I have not gone and compared and seen whether it's better to be a beach mouse or a forest mouse. But overall, looking at that population, because they can interbreed, it's a relatively small area. What does this figure tell you about being a pocket mouse in this area?
It's best either to be very light or very dark, not in between, because then you're night everywhere.
Right. So if you're intermediate, it doesn't matter where you are, you're going to get pretty, you're going to stand out to those predators, right? You're going to be out of the, okay. This is called a fitness landscape. This landscape, these hills and valleys, tell you where the phenotypes of the most fit individuals within this population. This is an example of a fitness landscape. Now you can have fitness landscapes that look pretty different. You can have fitness landscapes where if you're in the intermediate, you do way better. If you're one extreme, you do way better. In this case, with these mice, you best be one extreme or the other. So what is natural selection favoring in this case? What is that predation causing, I suppose?
Speciation.
It may be in the early stages of speciation. Why do you say that?
It's bimodal.
It's bimodal. It's pushing in two different directions. If your population starts out where everybody is here on this graph, which way is predation going to push your population over time? This way, right? Because anybody down here is going to get chomped. Okay? If your population starts off here, which way is predation going to push that population? Because anybody here is going to get chomped. Okay? So this is called divergence, right?
Disruptive selection.
Disruptive selection is causing divergence. Disruptive selection in particular is causing divergence into two separate, maybe someday, species. But it hasn't quite happened yet. Questions? Now that you see this example, does it make a little bit more sense when they were talking about fitness landscapes in the intro? Okay. This example is actually in your textbook. think it's in section 5.8, talks about Hopi Hoekstra, who has done a lot of this work. And she's actually tracked these differences in fur color to 3 genes. And the exact changes in those genes that cause changes in the phenotype, which is pretty cool. You can't often do that quite so easily, but in this case, she could. If these were the control populations of finches in the Hendry et al. Article, how would they map onto here? What would the phenotype be?
The phenotype would be beak size, and it would also be bimodal in this case, with large, very large beaks and very small beaks being, or moderately large and moderately small that are being selected for.
Okay, cool. All right, what I'd like you to do now is try to use some of what we've just talked about and use your draft summaries of the introductions. Share with each other what you summarized, what you understand, what still doesn't make sense, okay? Chat among your groups, and we'll be around to talk with you.
Once I read it for I did not take grades. One thing